Cody Zeiser is a Utah native that lives in Ogden. He is a member of USU Extension, and he's a county extension agricultural educator for both Utah, or for Weber and Morgan counties. And he's interested in sustainable production management practices for small farms. He's also interested in weed ecology and management. And so one of the projects that he's been working on is some weed control issues related to pumpkins and similar types of crops. And I'm going to give Cody the podium, and interested in hearing what he has to say to us today.
Thanks, Dan. Hope everybody can hear me well, just because I've jumped on a little bit later than everyone else. So make sure you let me know if there's something wrong. Anyways, I'm really happy to go after Carrie. Carrie actually helped me on our pumpkin weed control project, along with Dan as well. And so today we're going to focus our weed management mostly on prescribing your weed management practices to the weeds and the situation you're in. And then we're going to talk a lot about puncturevine, or goat heads. I really hate those sticker weeds. They've affected me my whole life. And I'm really excited to talk about managing them. That said, with all of these windstorms we've been having over the last few hours, I really feel for anyone out there that has high tunnels. I've got 3 high tunnels at home, comprising about 200 linear feet of growing space. And it's been a battle, so I feel for all of you. Another thing I'd like to mention as we jump into the presentation is that the Utah Vegetable Production and Pest Management Guide, as Dan mentioned previously, is going to be a great resource for you at home to recall what we're going to learn today and be able to apply it. And then secondly, you really need to make sure that if you have questions for your particular situation, that you reach out to your county extension office. You have somebody like me in all of your counties that is happy to answer your weed management and other production questions. So let's start off by thinking about what weeds are. I want you to imagine 3 scenarios quickly. First, think of an island that's newly arisen out of the sea, has no vegetation on it. The ground is completely bare. Secondly, think about a hillside after a landslide. It's also bare. And then thirdly, think of a forest fire that has wiped out a forest and all that's left is ash and bare ground. We can compare those settings to a freshly tilled or prepped garden bed or agricultural field. And the reason why we're thinking of these is because it has to do with weed ecology. Many of our weeds are what I like to call pioneer plants. They follow that succession of that bare ground, and they quickly become founders of communities where they quickly cover the soil, prevent erosion, prevent topsoil loss, and kind of form a nursery for the forest, or in Utah, the sagebrush steppe that's going to be forming after that catastrophic event. And so when we think of weeds, we have to remember they are plants.
Cody, can you speak up a little bit or turn up your mic? We can't hear you very good.
Okay. How about if I if I sit a little bit closer to the computer? Does that work?
That's helping a lot.
Okay, I will do that from now on. So a weed is really a plant that damages or reduces the productivity or quality of human managed and natural landscapes. So in certain conditions, they may not be a weed, like our Western salsify or common salsify that we learned about from Stephanie. And in other conditions, they are a weed. And when we think of managing weeds, we really need to think about it as if we are a doctor or veterinarian, somebody that's trying to diagnose a problem. you're not going to give a tetanus vaccine to manage smallpox. Similarly, you're not going to want to manage Russian olive trees the same way you would manage goat heads. So we need to know how weeds are classified, because that's going to help us think about what treatments we need to use. And so first off, we're going to talk about the anatomy of those weeds and how we classify them based on their physical appearance. So first off, we have broadleaf weeds, excuse me. Some examples of these are trees, shrubs, sunflowers, mustards, thistles, goat heads, of course. So these are weeds that have a leaf where the veins are branching, as you can see in this right-hand slide here. Let me just check my time. And so it has branching veins, tap roots are common, and they're chiefly not a grass. The second category when we're thinking of anatomy of weeds is our grassy weeds. Examples include quackgrass, cheatgrass, and foxtail. Notice on this picture on the right-hand side, all of the veins going up, that's the white structures, all of the veins going up and down that plant are parallel to each other, and they don't branch, opposite of what you see here in this picture. They also have fibrous roots. Another way we classify weeds is what time of the year they're growing in. And so if you look at the two graphs that I have below, our warm season weeds on the left-hand side tend to do most of their growth. That's where that peak is in the graph, is where we're seeing growth. And that occurs in the summertime. So, and then the opposite is true of our cool season weeds. They're going to produce a lot of root mass and leaf mass during our spring and fall months. It gets a little bit too cold during winter, but they do still grow a little bit. And then they can be completely dormant and look dried up by summertime. And then we have to think about how long our plants grow for. Are they perennial, as was defined in one of the previous presentations, where that's a plant that lives for several years? Or are they annuals, where they're only living for a single year? Or even biennial, which is an intermediate category. That's a plant that will probably germinate here in Utah in the fall or early spring, and it'll sit there and it'll put down roots, grow some leaves, and just kind of wait that whole year, preparing for year 2 when it sends up a lot of growth and sets seed. And then it usually dies after that. And they're a little tricky because they can actually be as annuals or perennials too, depending on growing conditions. So I wanted to give you a few ideas of some of the more common weeds that we see in each of these categories. So we've got field bindweed here on the left-hand side. People call it morning glory locally. That's a warm season perennial, meaning it's going to grow in the summer months primarily, and it may die back a little bit in the winter to where you don't see it around, it looks dead. And you think, oh, that's an annual, but it's actually regenerating from the same roots each year. The same thing is true for Bermuda grass, which is a grassy warm season perennial that we have on the right-hand side. Next up, we have our warm season annuals. And when it comes to vegetable production, specifically what we're going to talk about today, like pumpkins, you're going to find that your warm season annuals like to grow during the same conditions as your pumpkins. And so we've got common purslane here, which I understand in the certain settings, it's considered more of a crop by some people that like to eat it. And then we have kochia, puncturevine, and red root pigweed. Another good one to think about is lamb's quarters, and that tends to grow a lot like your kochia and your red root pigweed. Then you have cool season perennials. A lot of our cool season perennials here, if they're not a big shrub, are going to be your grasses, your perennial grasses that tend to be weedy on the farm. So foxtail barley and quackgrass. And then lastly, cool season annuals and biennials. On the left-hand side here, I have a rosette of a thistle, which would be which would have formed the first year, and then the second year you'll get that tall, powerful growth from that thistle. And then on the right-hand side, we have common mallow, which also grows during the warm season. It's kind of one of those intermediates. That's why I included it. And now we need to think about weed management. So once we know our weed, and if you have trouble identifying your weeds, make sure you reach out to Extension or you Google it. So when we think about weed management, let's go back to thinking of it as a prescription. When it comes to your prescription, there's a time of day, a number of times of day that it needs to be taken, and so on and so forth. A certain duration you take the medication. The same is true for weed management. And there are several methods. So think of this as your weed management strategies being tools for the garden. You're not going to use your hoe for every task in the garden, nor would you use a wrench to go out and pluck weeds from the ground. It would be very inefficient. So think of that as you think of your different methods. So I want to start with the first one, and this is always the cheapest method, and it's prevention. When we prevent weeds, we spend less money managing it. A great example of this is keeping those zebra mussels out of lakes in Utah. Seems like the state spends a lot of money trying to prevent them from getting into lakes. But I can tell you right now, once they're in a lake, the state will have to spend a lot more money mitigating the effects of that mollusk. So some common strategies for prevention are washing farm equipment before moving to a new field or a new bed, filtration of your irrigation water if you're on secondary, and then make sure that you choose your soil and compost sources wisely. If you go to your retailer or your gravel pit and you see a lot of goat heads or thistles growing on it or dyer's woad, whatever you have, I wouldn't use that source. I would move on to somewhere else. So prevention should always be your goal and your number one strategy. We can follow that up with cultural and mechanical controls, and we'll focus a little bit more on pumpkin from here on out. Cultural and mechanical controls I like to use hand in hand, and we got to think of both of these as an early, middle, and late season approach, especially when we're talking cucurbits, all of our melons, squashes, pumpkins, and so on. And the reason for that is when the plants are young, they tend to be a little bit vulnerable to competition, especially because they're working on getting themselves ready to do that massive growth. And it's also the time when they're most vulnerable. So 6 weeks after transplant or the seed germinating is kind of when that plant will start to be able to take a little bit more charge. But before then, they're pretty vulnerable. And so when we think about cultural controls, you've got plant competition, which is not going to be very good in a pumpkin's case early on. But later on, once you have those massive leaves and those tendrils covering the soil, then you can start to see a lot of those benefits from plant competition. Then we've got mulching. Mulching both plastic, fabric, and then some sort of organic material are all great to use. There's a lot of advantages that you could read about in that vegetable book for using it as far as plant establishment, holding in moisture, but it also controls weeds directly at the plant, but not necessarily in between rows, which can be a problem for fruit quality if you've got goat heads. And then debris removal. When we weed, we shouldn't be leaving weeds, especially if we think they might have viable seed out in that field. We should be making sure to remove those from the farm. Otherwise, we're just continuing the problem for either later in the year or in subsequent years. And then we have mechanical examples. Plowing and tilling and mowing are all great options early on, but once we see those tendrils extending, we have to move on and think of something else. Same thing with hoeing. Hoeing can be a great option. You want to be careful about damaging your plants. And then you need to also be mindful that one treatment of hoeing all summer long may not manage your warm season weeds very well. They like to germinate all season long, especially if there's a little bit of water in between the rows, if you're surface irrigating or sprinkler irrigating. And then we have solarization, which when you're laying plastic out in big swaths, you always need to be careful of wind. And then think about the cost of it as well as the storage, but it can be a great option. Lastly, I want to talk about our last tool, and it plays into a little bit of the project that we did recently. And so chemical control is the use of herbicides to keep weeds out of our pumpkins. And so there's a few different types, just like if we were prescribing a medication, there's all sorts of different classes. And so we're going to quickly talk about herbicide classes. And I've got over on the right-hand side, I have a little snippet from the vegetable production guide showing that there's a table that describes when it's appropriate to use different classes of herbicides. So first off, we have non-selective herbicides. These are the scorched earth method herbicides. The most commonly used one is glyphosate or Roundup. It will kill most plants, and you have to be extremely careful when using it. But at the same time, it may not be the best option for pumpkins, especially because it's going to be growing, or it's going to not persist for a very long time. And we're talking about warm season weeds, annuals, when we're growing pumpkins. Next up is a selective herbicide. The example here is carfentrazone or AIM. It's labeled for pumpkins, and it only kills targeted weeds. So if you've got grass planted in between your pumpkin rows as a nice bed to grow those pumpkins on, it doesn't damage those, but it kill the goat heads. And then we have pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicides. Those are herbicides that are used. If they're post-emergence, you use them after your weeds are up and growing. And if they're pre-emergence, you use them before you have weed germination, and it prevents them from ever breaking free from the soil. It attacks the plant as it comes out of the seed. So we did a pre-emergence herbicide trial in pumpkins for controlling goat heads. And the main reason for that is when we have goat heads or puncturevine, we tend to notice that you can hoe or pluck or pull all of your goat heads out 1 week, and 2 weeks later, you have a healthy crop that looks like you're growing goat head hay, just because it grows really fast and it has recurrent germination all year long. And so the reason why we chose chemical control options was because in a commercial agricultural setting, our commercial growers are paying all of their workers about $15 to $16 an hour. And if they're going out and hoeing every 2 weeks, it can become very costly and unprofitable for them. I'd like to try some of the organic methods following this project, but this is where we were at with them first off, because we wanted to see how effective it was and what it actually cost these growers. And then we chose pre-emergence herbicides because we wanted something that would last all season. So we only had to spray it once, and then we could forget it, and our pumpkins would be clean most of the year. So we tried this under two trials. One was sprinkler irrigation, and one was in a drip bed with plastic mulch, where we sprayed in between the rows to clean up those rows. And if you think about this, when you've got a pumpkin patch that people are going to pick pumpkins on, well, you don't want those stickers sticking all of their hands and getting in their little kids' shoes and stuff. And so that's one of the reasons why our commercial growers are really wanting a good treatment. There's some more information on this slide about our methods. We can talk about that later if we have time, but I really want to get into the results with our remaining minutes. So here's kind of what the field looked like 30 days after we sprayed. You can see, I hope you can hear me okay still. I kind of got a little bit back from the computer. But you can see here that we've got plots that don't have a lot of weed pressure. And then we have plots like these that have a lot of weed pressure. And that's because our 4 herbicides that we used were compared to untreated checks. That is, plots that weren't sprayed at all. And this plot right here is a classic example of one of those. So we're comparing the efficacy of our treatments against these types of plots. Right here, these magenta lines are really just separating the ends of plots. So we replicated this 4 times. Here's rep 1, here's rep 4 down here. And each one of these would be either the type of spray or no spray. Let's move on. So we looked at how effective this was at 30 days and at 60 days. And because we had such a dry year, there wasn't a lot of puncturevine growth in our drip trials 30 days after treatment. And so we weren't able to really do some sampling there because we really wanted to look at that 60-day target. And so we didn't want to do any destruction in our plots. The sprinkler trials, though, had enough growth that we were able to use little boxes that we were able to put out. We call them quadrats, that we were able to take a weed sample and know how much weed growth there was. And so right here on the left-hand side, I have a table for all of you. And of course, our untreated check should be 0% control. And then these other percentages are how well our herbicides did. So trifluralin is actually preen or treflan or trifor, has a few different names. And so you can see in the sprinkler trial at 30 days, we had about 52% control versus 24% 60 days in the sprinkler and 53% 60 days in the drip. Our 2 best herbicides, and I can't be 100% certain that these will be the best in every situation, were these 2. And their trade names are Curbit and Sandia. And you can see in the sprinkler at 30 days, Curbit or ethylfluralin controlled our puncturevine about 75%, and we were about 80% with the Sandia or halosulfuron. And then if we look over here at 60 days, we see that there was a massive failure across all of our treatments. And we'll look at that in the graph in just a second. And I have some ideas to why, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then if we move over to the drip, we can see we had great control still, clear out to 60 days in between those rows with those 2 chemicals, and decent control with S-metolachlor, which is metal or dual magnum, and then about 50% with the trifluralin. So if we look over at our graph here, you don't really need to pay attention to all of that madness that's going on. What I want you to pay attention to is the trend that you see. We don't have much of a drop here. We have a drop here, though. And that shows that that's just showing the amount of puncturevine that was growing in the plots. So on the left-hand side of each of those 3 graphs, you have our untreated checks that grew the most puncturevine, and then we have very little in these 2 herbicides plots. In fact, on both of these, we usually had about 2 plots that had over 90% control, 90 to 95% control. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the costs associated with spraying these products. And that's the whole reason why we wanted to do this, is we wanted to give them a cheaper way of doing this, where they only have so many workers, they've got large farms, and they've got budgets they have to stick to. And so when we look at our price per application on the acre level, these were our prices. And you can compare those to your budget sheets. With that, I would like to wrap up. That way I have a chance to answer your questions rather than just continuing on and maybe not sharing exactly what you're needing. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you, Cody. Let's see if we, we got the poll launched. So if you have an opportunity, take a minute while you're listening to me ask the questions and fill in that poll on for us. And we really appreciate that. Now we got a couple questions here. The first one was Madison asked, she has a Star of Bethlehem. What is that considered? Do you know Star of Bethlehem? And I don't.
I don't either. I can quickly Google it.
Nope. Let somebody else do that. Maybe we can get
Okay.
one of our other participants, or maybe someone else in the audience knows what Star of Bethlehem is. And is it a
I've heard the name, I just can't recall what it is.
Yeah, is it a broadleaf? It's not a grass, I know that. And is it an annual? Is it a perennial? It could be any of those things. So Randall asked the question, which herbicide was the safest on the pumpkins?
So that's a great question. With our pumpkins, in the sprinkler trial, we sprayed over the center of the row. So we were actually spraying on top of where those seeds were going to emerge. So we did what we call a post-plant pre-emergence. And that's where you've planted your seed and you try to plant it a little bit lower than where you're going to drive your herbicide to. And so you plant your seed and then you come and you spray over the top of it. We really wanted to look at what was safest, and we actually had trouble figuring that out, because in the sprinkler trial, we had a lot of bindweed grow, and it ended up complicating those matters because competition was so fierce. We couldn't tell what was plant competition or what was effect from the herbicide. Now, in the drip trial, we did directed spraying where you don't get any spray on that plastic mulch. It's just going in between. And so we didn't really notice anything. There has been a lot of research done, though, on these herbicides, and that's why I chose them, in all of the cucurbic crops. So melon, squash, pumpkin. And all of these are known to be fairly safe and not reduce yield too much. You do see a little bit of chlorosis after treatment usually, and the label, if you follow the label, you really can reduce a lot of those issues.
Okay. Yeah, so that kind of answers Bruce's question about whether there were some toxic side effects from the herbicides or not. Yeah. And it kind of comes down to whether you're spraying over top of them or whether you're directing it away from the plant and just cleaning inner row areas.
Mm-hmm.
And then another question from Sherilyn was, would the curbit and the sandia have any impacts on some of the grasses? Are these specific for broadleaf weeds, or do they have purpose for both?
As far as I'm aware, sandia is pretty good on grasses as well, if they're small. But a lot of these, since they are pre-emergence herbicides, they're best to use when the weeds are small, so less than 3 or 4 inches, and it will say that on the label. And it will also, I think it says that in the vegetable guide too, whether under which conditions you should be spraying them. I know that with AIM or carfentrazone that I mentioned earlier, it has no effect on grasses, but it's really good on broadleafs. And I can't remember exactly if curbit's effective on grasses after they've emerged or not. I'd have to go back and look at my charts. That tends to be the problem when you've got 60 or so herbicides in your head. You can't ever keep track of them, and so you never want to make promises.
I only let our weed science people do that type of stuff. I tend to reference my reference books, and so
Me too.
yeah. So these were all pre-emergence. We didn't explore any of the post-emergent sprays or any of that type of stuff to see what control we could get with with puncturevine control?
No, we didn't. And I'm fairly certain that some of your post-emergence would be great. The problem is, and you can spray halosulfuron sandia post-emergence as well. But the problem is your puncturevine, as well as your lamb's quarter and a lot of those warm season weeds like to germinate weekly. You'll go out and find more. And so it can be costly to go out and spray all the time. And then when we're thinking of late season interventions, you don't want to be spraying on top of your crop over and over, especially with post-emergence herbicides.
Okay, good. Well, I know we're at the end of our time, but I left 15 minutes there, and I know Cody has got to go because he has a weed board meeting that he needs to attend, and so he needs to leave us at this point. But I'm going to try and answer some of those other questions that people asked there, and if there are any additional questions from anyone related to any of the other topics that we had, now would be your time to put them into the question and answer, and then we will address those. And then at noon, we're going to close out the session. Certainly fill out the evaluations. We appreciate that. I think Ruby, are you around? Can you put up a link to the bigger survey questions that we want to have asked about things? And if so, just a way to put that on the screen so that people can do that. I'd really appreciate it. So here's another question that Ladina asked. She says, how do you know when to apply pre-emergence? Essentially, a pre-emergence should be applied when you have bare soil and no weeds. Okay, so that is usually the approach that we would take. Sometimes though, on larger scale farms, if we already have an existing weed problem that's up, we may insert a topical spray or an over-the-top spray, something like a Roundup type material that would then destroy and kill the weeds that are already there, and then use the pre-emergent to add a layer of protection so that reoccurrence of germination of some of the additional weeds wouldn't happen. So that's one of the approaches that you could take to help cover any weeds that are already emerged. And that's a pretty standard practice for some of our farmers to do those types of things. Another person asked, does it help to spray a broad spectrum herbicide early in the spring before planting to kill existing weeds, then use the pre-emergence? Yeah, that's kind of the answer that Ladina was asking. We could try and approach that by using something to kill the existing stuff and then put a layer of protection down from the pre-emergent. And then Nick says, does the row spacing on cucurbits affect the weed growth? More space, more weeds, he's asking. Yeah, there is some truth to that. So, but it also is a question of timing of the two events. If you think about your pumpkin plant, that was one of the things that we noted in the trial that we did where we were using sprinkler irrigation compared to drip irrigation. The drip irrigation system had a combination of plastic mulch and the herbicides, and the herbicide was sprayed between the row before the pumpkins grew off of the plastic onto the bare soil area. That worked very, very effective. So we were trying to come up with ways that are associated with some of our commercial farms are doing. However, if you looked at the bare soil one where we were using sprinkler irrigated, then what happens is every time we run our irrigation system, we may dilute out some of those chemicals that are there to provide the protection. And that's why we end up seeing this proliferation of weeds and the reduction in control. So those control numbers went down quite substantially for those types of crops. If you plant them closer together, that will work for a while in the row. But as you're looking at between row areas, it takes time for all of those things to occur. And during that time is when the weeds start to establish themselves. And so you're going to have multiple approaches. So thinking about what Cody was saying, that may be the time where you have to be thinking about some cultivation effects or some other mulching effects. If you're a smaller farmer and maybe can use something in between, that can all help deal with the weeds that are there. Another one, do you recommend a surfactant to help keep the spray on the weeds? It kind of depends, Rudy, on that question. The surfactants are useful, but you have to know what the label says. So one of the things I think we always need to remember is read the label, understand the label, follow the label specifically. And so for some of these materials, it suggests that you don't use surfactants. Others, it suggests that you do. So as you're looking at those materials, study that label. And if you're having some difficulty with that, get in contact with some of our extension educators that are in your particular county, and they can help you then kind of decipher what that means for those of you that might be just beginning to learn about these types of things. And then Rick said that he found that neither 2,4-D or the Roundup products are very effective. I think sometimes it depends on stage of plant development too. I find that these products even in farm settings, if the plants are a little bit too big, oftentimes they get away from you, and then the chemical doesn't really do its job. And so and then it could be a dosing component, and then again it could be that we've been using some of these materials for the long term, and the net effect of that is there is plants that are around the country that are showing resistance to these materials. And so we've got to use more than one approach. And so an IPM approach where we're using cover crops, mulches, where we're using tillage, where we're using chemistries, all of those things together can help us, kind of reduce the likelihood of us building up resistance in those areas. And then in high traffic work areas, Sherlyn asked whether we could use pre-emergence in those types of places. Yeah, that's certainly an option there. If there are foot traffic areas and things like that, that are going to constantly be foot traffic, there are a whole bunch of other ways that one can do it to try and kind of keep the weeds down and such. So yeah, once again, always be thinking about when we're using these chemistries too, what are you going to grow next? How does that plant potentially respond to it? So that's why it's really important. And we don't make any recommendations until we ask you guys a lot of questions about what you plan to do in the future, because carryover can be an issue on these types of things that could impact what you're going to do after your pumpkin crop or after your cucurbit crop of some sort. And so there's a lot of questions that have to go into thinking about how we're going to set up this thing.